As the autumn chill crept across the Montana Territory in 1876, Willow Mason stared at the empty space on her bedroom wall where her grandmother's wedding quilt had hung just that morning, the realization of its absence hitting her like a physical blow to the chest. The October wind whistled through the cracks in the small homestead cabin she shared with her husband of 3 years, Frank Mason, a man whose promises had proven as empty as the whiskey bottles that now littered their porch. Willow wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, her fingers tracing the wooden bedpost as she fought back tears that threatened to spill onto her hollow cheeks. That quilt, the last piece of her family's heritage, lovingly stitched by her grandmother's hands, was gone, sold for a few bottles of cheap whiskey. At 22, Willow had already weathered more hardship than most women twice her age. Her parents had succumbed to fever when she was 18, leaving her alone on the vast Montana frontier with nothing but the family homestead and the heirloom quilt her grandmother had gifted her before passing. The quilt had been her most treasured possession, a patchwork of memories and love that had kept her warm through lonely nights. Frank had seemed like salvation when he'd ridden into her life, handsome, charming, full of promises about helping her work the land. But 3 years of marriage had revealed his true nature. A man who preferred the bottle to the plow, whose smooth words turned to bitter curses when the liquor took hold. Willow sank onto the edge of the bed, her slender fingers working through her long auburn hair. She'd endured Frank's drinking, his gambling, even the occasional harsh word or bruising grip. But this stealing, the one thing she'd explicitly told him, was sacred. This felt like a deliberate cruelty she couldn't forgive. The front door slammed, jolting Willow from her thoughts. Frank's uneven footsteps stumbled across the wooden floor of their modest cabin. "Where are you, woman?" His words slurred together, the familiar stench of whiskey preceding him into the bedroom. "Got us some supplies." Willow stood, drawing herself up to her full height, which still left her nearly a head shorter than her husband. "You sold my grandmother's quilt." It wasn't a question. Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed, his unshaven face twisting into something ugly. "That old rag." "Weren't doing nothing but collecting dust." "It was all I had left of her, of my family," Willow said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the rage and sorrow battling inside her. "You knew what it meant to me." Frank threw a small sack onto the bed. "A few cans of beans, coffee, and a new bottle of whiskey spilled out. Got us provisions for winter, should be thanking me." "Where did you sell it?" Willow demanded, ignoring the meager supplies. "Who has it? What does it matter? It's gone." Frank's temporary good humor faded. "Stop your fussing about a damned blanket and fix me something to eat." Willow felt something snap inside her, a thread of patience, of hope, of love that had been stretched too thin for too long. "No," Frank blinked, clearly surprised by her defiance. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Willow's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I've mended your clothes, cooked your meals, tended this homestead while you drank away what little money we had. I've forgiven too much, Frank, but not this. Never this." His face darkened. "You ungrateful, get out," Willow interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "Get out and don't come back until you're sober, until you've made this right." Frank stepped toward her, hand raised, but Willow didn't flinch. Something in her eyes, perhaps the cold fury, the absolute certainty, made him hesitate. Without another word, he snatched up the whiskey bottle, turned on his heel, and stormed out of the cabin. Willow listened to his horse gallop away, the sound fading into the vast Montana wilderness. Only when she was certain he was gone did she allow herself to sink back onto the bed, her body trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. She knew Frank might return angrier, or he might not return at all. Either possibility left her facing the approaching winter alone. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that promised winter's swift arrival. Willow had slept little, her mind churning with worries and plans. Frank had not returned. She rose with the sun, fed the chickens and their lone milk cow, then saddled her mare. If Frank had sold the quilt in town, There was a chance she could track it down, appeal to whoever had purchased it. The 12-mile ride to Pinewood, the nearest settlement, gave Willow time to steel her resolve. The small frontier town consisted of little more than a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other buildings lining a single dusty street. As Willow rode in, she noted the usual bustle of morning activity, a wagon being loaded outside the general store, a couple of ranch hands watering their horses, women carrying baskets of goods. Willow tethered her horse outside the general store and straightened her simple calico dress. She'd sewn it herself from fabric bought with egg money, one of the few new items she'd been able to afford in years. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, the little bell announcing her arrival. Mr. Thornton, the storekeeper, looked up from his ledger. "Mrs. Mason, good morning to you. Don't usually see you in town this early." "Mr. Thornton," Willow nodded politely. "I'm looking for something that may have been sold to you yesterday, a quilt handmade with blue and red patches in a star pattern." Her voice wavered slightly. "My husband might have brought it in." Thornton's expression shifted, sympathy and discomfort crossing his weathered face. "I'm afraid your husband didn't bring that quilt to me, Mrs. Mason, though I did see him yesterday, heading into the saloon with a bundle under his arm." Willow's heart sank, but she thanked the storekeeper and stepped back into the bright sunlight. The saloon. Of course. Frank would have gone straight to the source of his troubles. The Rusty Nail Saloon stood at the far end of the street, its weathered sign creaking in the breeze. Willow hesitated outside its swinging doors. Respectable women didn't enter saloons, but the thought of her grandmother's quilt inside, possibly being used as a betting chip or worse, overrode her concern for propriety. Drawing a steadying breath, Willow pushed through the doors. The smell hit her first stale beer, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. A few early drinkers looked up in surprise as she entered, conversations faltering. Behind the bar, a portly man with an impressive mustache raised his eyebrows. "This ain't a place for ladies, madam," he said, wiping his hands on a dirty cloth. Willow approached the bar with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'm looking for a quilt that my husband, Frank Mason, may have sold here yesterday. It's a family heirloom and I'd like to buy it back." The bartender's face clouded with recognition. "Mason, yeah, he was in here raising hell yesterday, lost most of what he got for that quilt in a poker game, then drank away the rest." He shook his head. "Ain't seen him since." "The quilt," Willow pressed. "Who has it now?" The bartender glanced toward a corner table. "Hayes Callahan won it off your husband. He's the foreman at the Double Creek Ranch." He lowered his voice. "Decent sort, unlike some that come through here." Willow followed his gaze to a solitary figure sitting at a corner table, long legs stretched out before him, hat pulled low over his eyes as if dozing. Even in repose, there was something commanding about the man, a quiet strength in the breadth of his shoulders beneath a worn leather vest. Before she could lose her nerve, Willow crossed the room to stand before him. "Mr. Callahan?" The man tilted his hat up, revealing a face that startled Willow with its quiet intensity. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way Frank had been. His features were too weathered, his nose slightly crooked from what must have been a break, but his eyes were a startling blue, clear and direct as they assessed her. "Madam." His voice was low and graveled, like stones rolling in a creek bed. "My name is Willow Mason. I believe you won a quilt from my husband yesterday. It's a family heirloom and I'd like to buy it back from you." Hayes Callahan studied her for a long moment. He appeared to be in his early 30s with the lean, tough build of a man who worked hard for his living. His dark hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at the collar of his shirt, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "Your husband," he said finally. "That would be the fellow who couldn't hold his liquor or his cards. The one who kept talking about how he'd gotten the better end of the deal, trading an old rag for good whiskey." Willow flinched at the description but nodded. "Frank Mason." "Yes," Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly. "That old rag seemed mighty fine to me, handcrafted. Not the sort of thing a man should be trading for drink. No, Willow agreed, her voice tight. It wasn't his to trade. It was my grandmother's wedding quilt, the only thing I have left of my family. I'll pay you whatever you think is fair to get it back. Callahan gestured to the chair across from him. Sit a spell, Mrs. Mason. Willow hesitated, aware of the curious glances they were receiving, but then sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. What would you give me for it? Callahan asked, his gaze uncomfortably perceptive. I don't have much money, Willow admitted, but I could trade eggs, preserves. I make soap too, good soap with lavender, or I could work cleaning or mending. I'm handy with a needle. Something flickered in Callahan's eyes. Where's your husband now? Willow looked down at her clasped hands. I don't know, we disagreed about his selling the quilt. He left you alone with winter coming on. There was a sharp edge to Callahan's question. I can manage, Willow said, lifting her chin. I've been doing most of the work anyway. I just want my grandmother's quilt back. Callahan studied her for another long moment, then stood. Wait here. He disappeared into a back room, returning minutes later with a familiar bundle wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table between them. Your quilt, Mrs. Mason. Willow reached for it with trembling hands, unwrapping the corner just enough to confirm the familiar blue and red star pattern. Relief washed over her so strongly that for a moment she couldn't speak. Thank you, she finally managed. What do I owe you for it? Callahan shook his head. Nothing. But I insist it wasn't mine to keep, he interrupted. A man has no right to gamble away his wife's treasures. Willow clutched the wrapped quilt to her chest. I don't know how to thank you. No need. Callahan settled his hat more firmly on his head. You should get home before the weather turns. Feels like snow coming. As if his words had summoned it, Willow emerged from the saloon to find the bright morning had given way to gray clouds rolling in from the mountains. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. She secured the quilt carefully behind her saddle, relief mingling with anxiety as she considered the 12-mile ride home with a storm brewing. She was just mounting her mare when a voice called out behind her. Mrs. Mason. She turned to find Hayes Callahan leading a sturdy bay gelding from the livery. Looks like that storm's moving in faster than I thought, he said, glancing at the darkening sky. I'm heading out to the Double Creek, which passes near your place if I recall correctly. Would you mind some company on the ride? Willow hesitated. Riding alone with a man she barely knew wasn't proper, but neither was facing a snowstorm alone on the Montana plains. I would appreciate that, Mr. Callahan, she said finally. Thank you. They rode in companionable silence for the first few miles, the wind growing steadily stronger at their backs. Willow stole occasional glances at her companion. Hayes Callahan sat easily in the saddle, his posture suggesting he'd spent most of his life on horseback. There was a quietness about him that Willow found oddly comforting after years of Frank's volatile moods. Been at the Double Creek long? She asked as they forded a shallow stream. 5 years, Callahan replied. Hired on as a hand, worked my way up to foreman. You must be good with cattle. A slight smile curved his mouth. Good enough. Better with horses. You've been on your homestead long, 3 years with Frank. It was my parents' place before that. Callahan nodded, seeming to understand what she wasn't saying, that she'd been born to this hard life, not chosen it like so many who came west seeking fortune. The first snowflakes began to fall as they crested a rise overlooking Willow's modest homestead. The cabin sat nestled against a stand of pines, smoke curling from its chimney. Willow tensed at the sight. Someone's there. Your husband? Callahan asked, his hand moving subtly toward the revolver at his hip. Maybe. Willow's stomach tightened. She'd left the stove cold when she departed that morning. As they approached, the cabin door swung open. Frank stumbled out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Even from a distance, Willow could tell he was drunk, swaying slightly as he squinted at the approaching riders. That's far enough. Frank shouted, raising the rifle unsteadily. Callahan reined in his horse, motioning for Willow to do the same. Your husband appears to be in a shooting mood, he observed dryly. Frank? Willow called. "Put that rifle down, it's just me." Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "Who's that with you? Got yourself a new man already?" "This is Mr. Callahan from the Double Creek Ranch," Willow said, striving to keep her voice level. "He was kind enough to escort me home when the weather turned." Frank's gaze fixed on the bundle secured behind Willow's saddle. "What's that?" "What you got there?" "My grandmother's quilt," Willow answered. "Mr. Callahan returned it to me," Frank's face contorted with anger. "So you went behind my back, did you, shaming me in front of strangers?" "You shamed yourself when you stole from your wife," Callahan said, his quiet voice carrying across the yard. Frank swung the rifle toward him. "This ain't your business, Cowboy." "Frank, please," Willow said, dismounting slowly. "You're drunk, let's talk inside." "Nothing to talk about," Frank slurred. "This is my home, my land, my wife, and you," he gestured wildly with the rifle toward Callahan. "You ain't welcome here." Callahan remained calm, though Willow noticed his hand hadn't moved far from his sidearm. "Mrs. Mason is safely home now." "I'll be on my way." "No," Frank said, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "Think I'll teach you a lesson about meddling in a man's affairs first." What happened next unfolded so quickly that Willow barely had time to register it. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger just as his foot slipped on the frost-slicked porch. The rifle discharged, the bullet going wild as Frank crashed backward, his head striking the corner of the porch with a sickening crack. "Frank!" Willow rushed forward, Callahan close behind her. Frank lay sprawled on the porch, blood pooling beneath his head, eyes staring sightlessly at the gray sky. Callahan knelt beside him, pressed fingers to his neck, then looked up at Willow with grave eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mason. He's gone." Willow stared down at her husband's body, a tumult of emotions washing over her: shock, grief, and something that felt uncomfortably like relief. The snow fell more heavily now, dusting Frank's still form with white. "It was an accident," Callahan said quietly. "I witnessed it all. He slipped." Willow nodded numbly. "He was always careless with that rifle." Callahan stood, gently taking her elbow. "Let's get you inside, then I'll help you with him." The next few hours passed in a blur. Callahan wrapped Frank's body in a tarp and moved it to the small shed behind the cabin, promising to help Willow bring him to town for a proper burial once the storm passed. He chopped fresh wood for her stove, brought in water from the well, and tended to the livestock while Willow sat at her kitchen table, trying to make sense of how her life had changed so drastically in a single day. By evening, the storm had intensified into a full blizzard, the wind howling around the cabin's corners like a living thing. Callahan came in from his final check on the animals, snow dusting his broad shoulders. "Your cow and chickens are settled for the night," he said, removing his hat and coat by the door. "But I'm afraid I won't be able to leave until this storm breaks." Willow nodded, too exhausted to worry about propriety. "You're welcome to stay. I'd be grateful for the help with Frank tomorrow." "Of course." Callahan's eyes held nothing but kindness and respect. "I can sleep in the barn if that would make you more comfortable. Don't be ridiculous, you'd freeze to death." Willow gestured to the small settee near the stove. "It's not much, but it's warmer than the barn." After a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside. Willow found herself studying Hayes Callahan in the warm glow of the oil lamp. His presence should have felt intrusive on this strange, terrible day, but instead she found it oddly comforting. "That quilt," Callahan said suddenly, nodding toward where it lay carefully folded on a chair, "must be mighty special to you." Willow ran her fingers over the familiar pattern. "My grandmother made it for her wedding day. She taught me to sew on it, taught me that each stitch should be made with care and purpose. When she passed, she left it to me, said it would keep me warm when life turned cold." She gave a hollow laugh. "I suppose today proved her right." Callahan was quiet for a moment. "My mother was a quilter," he said finally. "Used to say you could tell the story of a person's life in the fabric they pieced together. Your mother sounds wise. She was." A shadow passed over his face. Lost her and my father to cholera when I was 16. Been making my own way since. I'm sorry, Willow said softly. Callahan shrugged. It was a long time ago, but I learned a bit of sewing from her. Comes in handy on the trail when there's no woman around to mend your things. Willow found herself smiling for the first time that day. A cowboy who can sew, that's a rare thing indeed. Don't go spreading that around, he said with a wry smile. Might ruin my reputation. The moment of lightness faded as Willow's gaze drifted toward the window where snow continued to fall heavily. What am I going to do now? She murmured, more to herself than to Callahan. What do you want to do? He asked. Willow considered the question. For years, her life had been defined by Frank's needs, his moods, his failures. Now, suddenly, she faced a future entirely her own. I want to keep my home, she said finally. This land was my parents', it's all I have left of them, but I don't know if I can manage alone. Callahan nodded thoughtfully. Winter's coming on hard, but you've got shelter, some livestock. The Double Creek isn't far if you need help. He hesitated. I could stop by now and then, make sure you're getting on all right. Willow looked at him, surprised by the offer. Why would you do that? Callahan met her gaze steadily. Because it's the right thing to do. And because I think you deserve a chance to make your own way without having to rely on men like Frank Mason. Something warm unfurled in Willow's chest at his words, not attraction, not yet, but a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I would appreciate that. They buried Frank 2 days later when the storm finally broke. The local preacher said a few words over the simple grave in the Pinewood Cemetery, but there were few mourners, just Willow, Hayes Callahan, and a handful of townsfolk who'd known Frank from his frequent visits to the saloon. As they rode back toward her homestead, Willow felt a strange sense of liberation mingling with her grief. Frank had not been a good husband, but she had tried to be a good wife. She had nothing to reproach herself for. What will you do now? Callahan asked as they crested the rise overlooking her cabin. Survive the winter, Willow said simply. After that, I don't know, the land is mine now, I could sell it, move to town. Is that what you want? Willow gazed at the small homestead, seeing not just its present state but its potential, the garden she could expand in spring, the extra room she'd always wanted to add to the cabin, the life she could build on her own terms. No, she said finally. This is my home, I want to stay. Callahan nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected about her. Winter's the hardest time to be alone. I'll check on you when I can. True to his word, Hayes Callahan began stopping by the Mason homestead every week or so. Sometimes he brought supplies from town, coffee, sugar, things too heavy for Willow to easily transport on her own. Other times he arrived with his tools, fixing the leak in her roof, reinforcing the chicken coop against predators, or splitting wood for her stove. Willow found herself looking forward to his visits, planning for them by baking extra bread or cooking stew when she expected him. They fell into an easy rhythm of companionship, talking about the weather, the livestock, books they'd read. Never about Frank. As December deepened, bringing holidays that Willow had little heart to celebrate, Callahan arrived with an unexpected gift fabric, several yards of beautiful calico in shades of green and gold. Thought you might like something cheerful, he said gruffly, looking almost embarrassed as he handed over the package. For sewing, or whatever women do with such things. Willow ran her fingers over the lovely material. It's beautiful, thank you. That evening, as they sat by her stove, Callahan watched her work on mending one of her few dresses. His gaze was thoughtful as she expertly guided the needle through the worn fabric. Your quilt, he said suddenly. It's looking a bit worn in places. Willow glanced at where it now hung on her wall, restored to its proper place. Yes, it's old and Frank wasn't careful with it. There are a few tiers that need mending. Callahan was quiet for a moment, then said, I might be able to help with that if you'd let me. Willow looked at him in surprise. You want to mend my quilt? I told you my mother taught me to sew. He shrugged, a faint flush visible beneath his tan. I'm no expert, but I can do neat work when I need to. The following evening, Callahan returned with his own small sewing kit tucked into his saddlebag. Willow carefully took down the quilt and spread it on the table. Together, they examined the worn areas, the small tears where Frank's carelessness had damaged it. "Here," Willow said, showing Callahan where to begin, "the stitches need to be small and even." He nodded, his large hands surprisingly deft as he threaded a needle. Willow watched, fascinated, as this strong man who could break a wild horse and face down armed drunks bent his head in concentration over delicate needlework. "You're good at this," she observed as he finished a nearly invisible repair. "Don't sound so surprised," he said with a smile. Cowboys who can't mend their own clothes end up mighty ragged. They fell into a comfortable routine, working together on the quilt by the light of her lamp. Outside, snow fell gently, insulating the cabin in a cocoon of quiet. Willow found herself telling Hayes stories about her grandmother, about the history of each patch in the quilt. He listened attentively, occasionally sharing stories of his own mother, of growing up on a small farm in Missouri before heading west. When the clock on her mantel struck 10, Hayes reluctantly set aside his work. "It's getting late. I should head back to the ranch." Willow glanced worriedly at the window where snow continued to fall. "It's another storm. You shouldn't ride in this." Hayes hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "The settee is still available," Willow said, making the decision for him. "And I'd sleep better knowing you weren't freezing to death on my account." He relented with a nod. "Just until morning, then." That night, as Willow lay in her bed behind the curtain that separated her small bedroom from the main room of the cabin, she listened to Hayes's steady breathing from the settee. His presence should have made her uncomfortable, a man who wasn't her husband sleeping just a few feet away, but instead, she felt safer than she had in years. Morning brought clear skies and Hayes's reluctant departure. But 2 days later, he returned with more thread and a piece of blue fabric that matched her quilt so perfectly that Willow gasped in surprise. "Where did you find this?" "Traded for it in town," he said, looking pleased at her reaction. "Thought it might help with that worn corner." They worked on the quilt together through the long evenings of December, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed needle and thread. Willow began to notice things about Hayes Callahan, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the careful gentleness of his large hands, the deep timbre of his voice when he told stories about his time on cattle drives. On Christmas Eve, Hayes arrived with a small pine tree tied to his saddle, along with a package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like some holiday cheer," he said, setting up the little tree in the corner of her cabin. Willow was touched by his thoughtfulness. "I haven't celebrated Christmas properly since my parents passed," she admitted. "Then it's high time you did." Hayes handed her the package. "This isn't much, but—" Willow unwrapped it to find a beautiful wooden box, its surface carved with delicate flowers. "Hayes, it's lovely." "For your sewing things," he explained. "Made it myself. Not as fine as store-bought, but it's perfect," Willow interrupted. "I've never had anything so beautiful." She'd made him a gift, as well, a new scarf knitted from wool she dyed herself in a deep blue that matched his eyes. When he wrapped it around his neck, his smile warmed her more than the fire in her stove. They shared a Christmas meal of roast chicken and apple pie, and afterward, Hayes took out his harmonica, filling the cabin with sweet, simple tunes. When he played Silent Night, Willow found herself humming along, then singing softly, her clear voice blending with the music. Hayes watched her with something new in his eyes, a warmth, an admiration that made her cheeks flush and her heart beat faster. "You have a beautiful voice, Willow," he said when the song ended. It was the first time he'd called her by her given name, and something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, an acknowledgement of feelings growing beyond simple friendship. The quilt lay forgotten on the table that night as they talked until the fire burned low, sharing stories of Christmases past and dreams for the future. When Hayes finally rose to leave the clear night, making travel safe, Despite the late hour, he paused at her door. "Willow," he said, his voice low and serious, "I've come to care for you a great deal these past weeks." Willow's heart fluttered in her chest. "I care for you too, Hayes. I don't want to rush you. It's been less than 2 months since Frank passed." "People will talk let them talk," Willow said with sudden fierceness. "I mourned the man I thought Frank was long before he died. I won't pretend to grieve now just to satisfy town gossips." Hayes studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Even so, I want to do right by you. To court you properly if you'll allow it." Willow smiled, a warm happiness spreading through her. "I'd like that very much." The deep winter months that followed were the happiest Willow could remember. Hayes came nearly every evening now, helping with chores, sharing meals, working on the quilt by firelight. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, each content with the other's presence. Word spread through the small community about the Double Creek foreman courting the widowed Mrs. Mason. There were whispers, of course, about how quickly Willow had moved on, about the circumstances of Frank's death, but Hayes's solid reputation and the respect he commanded silenced most critics. By February, the quilt was fully restored, more beautiful than ever, with Hayes's careful stitching reinforcing Willow's grandmother's original work. They hung it back on the wall together, their hands lingering as they smoothed the fabric. "My mother would have liked you," Hayes said softly. "She always said you could tell a person's character by how they treated things others might consider unimportant." Willow turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close they stood. "And what does my quilt tell you about my character? That you honor what came before you. That you're willing to fight for what matters." His hand moved to gently touch her cheek. "That you have an incredible capacity for love even after being hurt." Willow leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his. "Your mother taught you well." When Hayes kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey. His lips were gentle, questioning, and Willow answered by stepping closer, her hands resting on his chest where she could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. "I love you, Willow Mason," Hayes whispered against her hair. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you walked into that saloon, holding your head high despite everything." "I love you too," Willow said, the words feeling both new and familiar on her tongue. "You brought light back into my life when I thought it had gone dark forever." As February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to emerge from beneath the snow, Hayes and Willow began making plans. He proposed properly one evening in late March, kneeling before her with a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." "It's perfect," Willow whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "I don't need anything fancy." "That's good," Hayes said with a smile, "because a ranch foreman's salary doesn't stretch to diamonds. But I promise you this, Willow, I'll work every day to be worthy of your love, to build a life with you that's full of joy and honesty." "That's worth more than all the diamonds in the world," Willow told him, sealing her promise with a kiss. They married in April as the first wildflowers began to dot the Montana plains. The ceremony was small, held in the Pinewood Church with just a few friends in attendance. Willow wore a new dress she'd made from the green and gold fabric Hayes had given her for Christmas, and her grandmother's quilt was carefully folded over her arm as she walked down the aisle. After the ceremony, the ranch owner surprised Hayes with news that changed their plans in the best possible way. "I'm getting too old to run the Double Creek alone," Mr. Edwards told them at the small reception. "Been thinking of taking on a partner. Someone who knows cattle and has a good head for business." He clapped Hayes on the shoulder. "What do you say, Callahan? You and your bride interested in building something together? There's that old foreman's house on the north pasture needs work, but it's solid. Could be a fine home for a family." Hayes looked at Willow, the question clear in his eyes. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "We'd be honored, Mr. Edwards." Later that night, In the privacy of their cabin, their last night there before moving to their new home on the Double Creek, Hayes and Willow lay beneath her grandmother's quilt, the firelight casting a warm glow over their entwined figures. "Are you sure about this?" Hayes asked, tracing the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. "Leaving your family's homestead?" Willow snuggled closer to him, savoring the solid warmth of his body next to hers. "The land was important to me because it was all I had left of my family, but now I have you. We'll build our own legacy, make our own memories." "Still," Hayes said thoughtfully, "we should keep the land, maybe lease it out for now. Our children might want it someday." Willow's heart swelled at the casual way he spoke of their future children. "Our children," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." Hayes kissed her then, a kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams to be fulfilled. Outside, a gentle spring rain began to fall, washing away the last of winter's snow and nourishing the earth for new growth. As summer bloomed across the Montana territory, Willow and Hayes settled into their new life at the Double Creek. The old foreman's house, once neglected, blossomed under their care. Hayes repaired the sagging porch and leaking roof, while Willow planted a garden and hung crisp curtains in the freshly washed windows. Her grandmother's quilt took pride of place on the wall of their bedroom, a daily reminder of the journey that had brought them together. Willow discovered she had a talent for ranch bookkeeping, organizing the Double Creek's accounts with an efficiency that impressed even the skeptical Mr. Edwards. Hayes, freed from some of the administrative burdens that had plagued him as foreman, thrived in his new role as partner, implementing breeding programs that promised to improve their herd quality for years to come. By August, Willow had news that made their happiness complete. "A baby," Hayes whispered in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Due in early spring," Willow confirmed, her eyes shining with joy, "just when everything is new again." As her pregnancy progressed, Willow began working on a new project, a baby quilt, pieced together from scraps of meaningful fabric. A bit of her wedding dress, a square from one of Hayes's old shirts, a patch from the first curtains they'd hung in their new home. Each evening, Hayes would join her by the fire, sometimes helping with the stitching, other times simply watching her work while they talked about their day and their dreams for their growing family. On a snowy night in early March 1878, almost exactly a year after they had first acknowledged their love, Willow gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Hayes paced anxiously outside their bedroom as the midwife attended to his wife, his face breaking into a radiant smile when he was finally allowed to enter and see his daughter. "She's perfect," he breathed, carefully taking the swaddled infant from Willow's arms. "Look what we made, Willow. Look what your love created." Willow watched, her heart overflowing as this strong man who had once mended her quilt by firelight cradled their daughter with infinite tenderness. "What shall we name her?" Hayes looked thoughtful. "What was your grandmother's name, the one who made the quilt?" "Hope," Willow said softly. "Her name was Hope." "Then that's her name," Hayes decided, gently returning the baby to Willow's arms. "Hope Callahan, because that's what you gave me, Willow. Hope for a future brighter than I ever imagined possible." As spring returned to Montana, bringing with it new life and renewed promise, Willow often sat on the porch of their home, baby Hope sleeping against her shoulder, watching Hayes work with the horses in the corral. In those quiet moments, she would remember that awful day when she discovered her grandmother's quilt missing, the confrontation with Frank, the desperate ride to town. What had seemed like the worst day of her life had ultimately led her to the best days, to Hayes, to hope, to a love built on respect and kindness rather than empty promises. Sometimes, fate worked in mysterious ways, turning moments of deepest despair into pathways to joy. One evening, as they sat together on the porch swing, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Willow shared this thought with Hayes. He nodded, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I've thought the same. If your husband hadn't been the kind of man who would sell your quilt for whiskey. And if you hadn't been the kind of man who would return it. And if I hadn't been the kind of cowboy who could sew by firelight, Hayes added with a smile. Willow laughed softly, turning to kiss his cheek. Our story would make a strange tale indeed. The best stories often do, Hayes replied, pulling her closer, and ours is just beginning. As twilight deepened into night, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky, Willow Mason Callahan rested her head on her husband's shoulder, perfectly content in the knowledge that their love born from an act of cruelty transformed by kindness would continue to grow, stitch by careful stitch, through all the seasons of their lives together. By the time Hope was taking her first steps, Willow was expecting their second child. The Double Creek Ranch prospered under Hayes and Mr. Edwards' partnership, expanding to include neighboring lands when opportunities arose. Hayes had a natural talent for business that complemented his skills with livestock, while Willow's careful bookkeeping ensured their growing enterprise remained financially sound. Their son, William, was born in the summer of 1879, a sturdy boy with Hayes's blue eyes and Willow's determined spirit. Hope, now a chattering toddler, took to her role as big sister with characteristic enthusiasm, insisting on helping Willow with the baby at every opportunity. "She's just like you," Hayes observed one evening as they watched Hope carefully tuck her doll beneath a miniature quilt Willow had made for her, "always taking care of others." "And William is already showing your patience," Willow replied, glancing at their infant son contentedly examining his own fingers in his cradle. "Heaven help us when they're teenagers." Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. The old homestead, leased to a young couple starting out much as Willow and her parents had, provided additional income that Hayes insisted they save for the children's futures. Each Sunday, they would drive their wagon to Pinewood for church, then visit Frank's grave, a ritual Hayes had suggested and Willow had gratefully accepted, allowing her to finally make peace with that chapter of her life. "I used to think I'd failed him somehow," she confessed to Hayes on one such visit, as they stood beside the simple marker while the children played nearby under the watchful eye of friends. "That if I'd been a better wife, he might have been a better man." Hayes took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Some people can't be saved from themselves, Willow. Frank made his choices. You've made yours. That's all any of us can do." In the autumn of 1881, Mr. Edwards announced his intention to retire completely, offering Hayes the opportunity to buy his remaining share of the Double Creek. It was a substantial financial commitment, but one that Hayes and Willow decided to make, using the savings they'd accumulated along with a loan from the newly established bank in Pinewood. "It's a risk," Hayes acknowledged as they signed the papers, "but I believe in what we've built here." "As do I," Willow agreed. "And it's a legacy for Hope and William, a foundation for their futures." The transition to full ownership brought new responsibilities and challenges. Hayes found himself spending long days in the saddle, supervising the far reaches of the expanded ranch, while Willow juggled the demands of running the household, caring for 2 active children and managing the ranch accounts. On a bitterly cold night in January 1882, Hayes returned from a 3-day trip to the northern pastures to find Willow asleep at the kitchen table, ledger books spread before her, ink staining her fingers. He carried her gently to bed, his heart aching at the exhaustion evident in her face even in sleep. The next morning, he announced a decision. "We're hiring help, a proper housekeeper and a bookkeeper." Willow began to protest, but Hayes shook his head firmly. "The ranch can afford it now." "You've been trying to do the work of 3 people, Willow. It's not sustainable." "I don't want to become one of those useless ranch wives who does nothing but attend social functions," Willow argued. Hayes laughed. "I don't think that's a risk with you, my love. But there's a difference between working hard and working yourself into exhaustion. Besides," he added with a knowing smile, "I thought you might want more time for your quilting." Willow's expression softened. "Since Hope's birth," She had created quilts for both children and several neighbors' babies. What had begun as a personal connection to her grandmother's memory had evolved into a genuine artistic outlet, her designs growing more intricate and beautiful with each creation. "Perhaps a housekeeper would be helpful," she conceded, "but I'll continue with the bookkeeping." "How about this?" Hayes suggested. "We'll hire a young man from town to assist you, someone who can learn from your expertise while taking on some of the day-to-day entries. You'll still oversee everything, but with less of the tedious work." This compromise satisfied Willow, and within a month, the Callahan household included Mrs. Thornton, a cheerful widow who managed the cooking and cleaning with brisk efficiency, and Timothy Wells, a serious 17-year-old with a talent for numbers who cycled in from town 3 times a week to assist with the ranch accounts. With more time for her family and her quilting, Willow flourished. She began experimenting with new patterns and techniques, incorporating skills she learned from books ordered from back east. When the Ladies' Aid Society of Pinewood organized a county fair in the summer of 1882, Willow entered one of her quilts an original design featuring stylized Montana wildflowers and won the blue ribbon. "You should sell these," Hayes suggested as they admired the ribbon pinned to her quilt. "There were at least a dozen people asking if you take commissions." Willow considered the idea. "Perhaps I could. It would be nice to contribute more directly to our income again." "That's not why I suggested it," Hayes said, drawing her into his arms. "You have a gift, Willow. Sharing it with others would bring joy beyond our family." By Christmas of that year, Willow had completed 4 commissioned quilts, each one uniquely designed for the family who would use it. Word of her talent spread beyond Pinewood, bringing orders from as far away as Helena. She converted a sunny corner of the house into a sewing room, where fabric and threads in a rainbow of colors were neatly organized in the wooden box Hayes had given her that first Christmas. "I never imagined this life," Willow confessed to Hayes on New Year's Eve as they stood on their porch watching the stars after the children had gone to bed. "When Frank died, I thought I'd spend my days just struggling to survive." Hayes pulled her close against the winter chill. "And now I know what it means to truly live," she said, turning in his arms to kiss him. "To love completely and be loved in return, even when I track mud into your clean kitchen," Hayes teased. "Even then," Willow laughed, "though I reserve the right to complain about it." As 1883 dawned, bringing with it Willow's 30th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had discovered her husband had sold her precious quilt for whiskey seemed a lifetime away from the woman she had become: confident, successful, deeply loved. On a crisp April morning, as Willow worked on a new quilt design in her sewing room, Hayes appeared in the doorway with an envelope in hand. "Letter came for you," he said, an odd note in his voice that made Willow look up sharply. "What is it? Not bad news?" Hayes shook his head, handing her the envelope. "It's from back east, a magazine called Godey's Ladies' Book." Willow's eyes widened. Godey's was the most popular women's magazine in the country, featuring fashion, literature, and domestic arts. She opened the letter with trembling fingers, reading quickly, then looking up at Hayes in disbelief. "They want to publish my quilt patterns," she whispered. "Mrs. Carson from Helena sent them photographs of the quilt I made for her daughter's wedding, and they—" She swallowed hard. "They're offering me a regular column on quilting techniques." Hayes's face broke into a wide smile. "I knew it. I knew others would see what I see in your work. But how can I? We're in Montana, they're in Philadelphia." "They mention that in the letter," Hayes pointed out. "They're willing to work by mail, and the rail line makes shipping quite reliable these days." Willow read the letter again, excitement building. "The payment they're offering is quite generous." "You deserve every penny," Hayes said firmly. "Your designs are beautiful, Willow. Unique. Of course they want to share them with women across the country." That night, after writing an enthusiastic acceptance to Godey's editors, Willow lay in Hayes's arms, still marveling at this unexpected turn in her life. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if Frank hadn't sold my quilt that day?" Hayes was quiet for a moment, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "I suppose I might never have met you, or at least not in the same way." "Everything would be different," Willow murmured. "Perhaps," Hayes agreed. "But I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow, that some things are meant to be regardless of the path." Willow smiled in the darkness. "The romantic cowboy who sews by firelight, who would have thought?" "Only you," Hayes said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Only you have ever seen all of me." As spring bloomed into summer, and Willow's first column appeared in Godey's Lady's book, Hayes surprised her with another gift, an addition to their home that would serve as a proper studio for her growing business. Large windows let in abundant natural light, built-in cabinets stored her ever-expanding collection of fabrics and notions, and a large table allowed her to lay out even her most ambitious designs. "This is too much," Willow protested when he first showed her the space. "It's exactly enough," Hayes countered. "Your work deserves a proper home, just as you do." Over the years that followed, Willow's reputation as a quilter and pattern designer continued to grow. Her monthly column in Godey's led to a book of patterns published in 1885, and invitations to teach at quilting circles throughout the territory. Through it all, Hayes remained her strongest supporter, managing the ranch and children during her occasional absences, proudly displaying her work in their home, and still, sometimes, joining her by the fire to add a few careful stitches to whatever project currently occupied her hands. Hope, inheriting her mother's talent with needle and thread, became Willow's eager apprentice, while William showed Hayes's affinity for ranching, accompanying his father on rounds from the time he could sit a horse. The Double Creek prospered under their stewardship, becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory as Montana moved toward statehood. On a warm evening in the summer of 1889, as Montana prepared to join the Union as the 41st state, the Callahans hosted a barbecue for their neighbors, ranch hands, and friends from Pinewood. Tables set up under the cottonwoods groaned with food, a fiddle player provided music for dancing, and lanterns illuminated the yard as twilight descended. Willow, now a graceful woman of 36 with threads of silver beginning to appear in her auburn hair, stood with Hayes watching Hope, now 12, teaching a group of younger children a circle dance while 17-year-old William deep in conversation with Mr. Edward's granddaughter by the punch bowl. "We've built something good here," Hayes said, his arm around her waist. "Better than good," Willow agreed, leaning into his solid warmth. "Something wonderful." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children gone to bed, Willow led Hayes to their bedroom where her grandmother's quilt still hung on the wall, its colors softened with age but its beauty undiminished by time. "Do you remember what you told me that first night you stayed in my cabin?" she asked. "About my quilt." Hayes's eyes crinkled at the memory. "I said it must be special to you. And I told you my grandmother said it would keep me warm when life turned cold." Willow took his hands in hers. "She was right about the quilt, but it was you, Hayes Callahan, who truly brought warmth back into my life." Hayes gathered her close, his kiss as tender as those first tentative ones they had shared by firelight so many years ago. "And you, Willow Mason Callahan, have been the light of mine." Outside their window, stars glittered in the vast Montana sky, bearing witness to a love that had begun with a stolen quilt, a chance encounter, and a cowboy who knew how to sew by firelight, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing season, each challenge overcome, each joy shared. From that first moment, when Hayes had returned her grandmother's treasured quilt, neither could have imagined the rich tapestry their lives would become threads of hardship and happiness, work and rest, passion and peace, woven together by patient hands and faithful hearts into something beautiful and enduring. Like the quilt that had brought them together, their love was a masterpiece crafted stitch by careful stitch repaired when torn, treasured when tested, passed down as a legacy to their children and all who knew them. A testament to the truth that sometimes, from the most painful losses come the most precious gifts, and that with enough care, even the most broken pieces can be transformed into something whole and beautiful once more.